The Pharisee and the tax collector are both orienting themselves in different ways. One, I believe, is an orientation that's going to lead to life. The other, unfortunately, an orientation that's going to lead to death. And so we're going to be examining how we ought to orient ourselves, how God's instructing you to orient yourself. And I pray that the Holy Spirit will help us because he wants to change all of our lives. He is not content with where you are right now. He has plans for you, as Caroline read, plans and purposes. He wants to take you on a journey, and you're not done yet. Who can say amen to that? I know God's not done with me. Crystal, if you don't mind putting up this is called the Ebbinghaus illusion. Which orange circle is larger? They're the same. Yeah. So it's interesting. The way this illusion is supposed to work is that, and different people find it to be more effective than others, but the circles are both the same. And if you just kind of see as we transfer each slide, it becomes more and more apparent until it's painfully obvious that they're identical. It's called the Ebbinghaus illusion because most people say the circle that's smaller is the one that's surrounded by the larger dots. Our eyes can sometimes deceive us. What we assume we're seeing is not always accurate. There was this study that was done. It was a cab sav study, is what I'm calling it. It's a wine drinking study. Unfortunately for today's communion, we don't have any cab sav. It's just grape juice. But there was this cab sav study. It was an interesting study. And what they did was they put participants in a scanning machine, like a CT, I don't know, what do you call like a brain scan? They could scan the brain. And what they found was that they would give each participant a glass of wine and a corresponding price, right? So it's like, here's your $5 cab sav, okay? And here's your $45 cab sav, okay? And then they do, here's your $45 cab sav and a $90 cab sav. And they kept doing this, and they brought all these different participants through. And what they found was the price that was labeled with the wine dictated the enjoyment on the brain scan. And also the wines were all the same price. So whether it was a $5, when they said it was a $5 and a $45, they were both $5 wines. But people perceived the $45 one as more enjoyable, and their brain chemistry reinforced that. They actually felt it was more enjoyable. And the same with the $50 and the $90. So perception, like our taste buds, can be deceived. So our eyes can be deceived with illusions. Our taste buds can be deceived with the suggestion of value. But we ought to be careful with this one impression. And that impression is this. Are we good judges of where we're headed? Are we good judges of our heart? Are we good judges of the direction of our life? And the Bible gives us some warnings and some suggestions in this, okay? We're going to look at the Bible, but first I want to take you to the realm of comparative psychology. There's this whole field of research called comparative psychology. And we can do these two things called downward comparison and upward comparison. So let's start with downward comparison. Downward comparison, you've probably all done it at some point in your life. You look at somebody that's not doing quite as well as you are in whatever domain that is. Perhaps it's Brian on guitar. He's looking at my guitar playing in order to make himself feel better, right? He's like, oh, that's where Dennis is, but I'm better. Or perhaps it's, your finances, right? So you're like, we're debt free. We have, we just have a little bit on our mortgage. So we're not completely debt free, but we're better than so-and-so who's covered with credit card debt. That would be downward comparison. Now, what the research says is that downward comparison is a double-edged sword. It can both be helpful and it can be harmful. How can it be helpful? Sometimes it can be helpful when we see traits in other people that we recognize as not winsome or not helpful. So for instance, like, our kids were hanging out with their cousins and there were certain behaviors that came up that our kids saw in their cousins. And it's things that we've been telling our kids for quite some time that you shouldn't do. But once they experienced it for themselves from another kid, they had this moment where it was just like clarity. And one of our kids said, you know what? I didn't like it when my cousin just kept speaking over top of what I was trying to say. Aha. And sometimes we can see traits in other people that help us make course correction in our life, right? That's a positive way that we can find direction and guidance in our life. We can get coordinates. A negative way is when I look at somebody else in order to build up my own self-esteem. So I put a negative value on somebody else. I say, they're not as good as I am in this domain. I feel better about myself. See the difference? One is observing a trait in somebody else and trying to develop a fix for that trait in my own life. The other is assigning a value to the other person based on that trait so that you can have more value. Downward comparison can be helpful, but it so easily goes off the rails. Upward comparison is exactly the same. It's looking at somebody like in your life that you look up to and you respect, and you're like, I want to emulate that. That's the positive side of upward comparison. I look up to this individual. I want to mold my life after them because I respect and love them. Great. Upward comparison can be so helpful. But psychologists say it can also freeze us. Because if you look up to somebody and all of a sudden you say, they're better than I am, they're more valuable than I am, it can freeze you. It has this ability to both set us free, but also to freeze us. Upward comparison and downward comparison. So the best psychological feedback that I read was this. The best person to compare yourself with is yourself yesterday. The person you're supposed to compare yourself with is who you were yesterday, okay? As opposed to who somebody else is today. I think that's pretty wise and sound advice. Now, I think this passage that we're looking at today will take it even further and give us an even higher view of how we can navigate and guide our lives. So in this passage, the Pharisee, he's using downward social comparison. He's saying he's standing in the temple, and notice his location. It says he's in the temple. It says that the tax collector stands far off, but not so with the Pharisee. The Pharisee has found himself a prominent spot in the temple because he feels good about himself. And it says he stood by himself and he prayed. And from my understanding of what I've researched in the Greek text, there's some sort of ambiguity there. It could be interpreted, he stood by himself and prayed. It can also be understood, he stood by himself and prayed to himself. So there's kind of an idea of like, who is he praying to? Who is the object of his worship? And Luke kind of keeps it ambiguous. And you'll see why. Because as he prays, he says, Lord, I thank you that I am not like the other people. And he starts doing this horizontal and downward look. I'm not like those thieves. I'm not like the robbers or the adulterers. And particularly, I'm not like that tax collector over there. Downward social comparison in order to make himself feel better. He's trying to inflate his own worthiness. To who? Who's he trying to prove this to? To God? Do you think he can fool God? That's why there's this suggestion. Perhaps he's just speaking to himself. And this is the first thing I want to say to you today, directly. When you're praying, who are you praying to? Who are you praying to? Who are you addressing? Are you addressing the divine, the God who knows everything about you? Or are you trying to put on airs before who? Ask yourself, who am I praying to? This Pharisee was putting on airs, trying to make himself feel good by comparing downward. And then he says, and check this out, God. I have a great resume. Did you know that I fast twice a week? Did you know that I give 10% of all that I have? What's he doing there? He's trying to promote to God his sense of worthiness, his sense that he is deserving of hearing, of being in relationship with the divine. And then we go to the tax collector. The tax collector, it says, stood afar off. If you can see that picture, Crystal, in the picture you can see there's the Pharisee in the distance. The tax collector leaning up against the pillar, head down, he can't even look up, fist on his chest. He's beating his chest saying, God, I am aware of my own brokenness. I'm aware of it. Would you be merciful to me, the sinner? It's interesting. In the Greek, it says the sinner, as if he's the only one. That's a great perspective. It's a great perspective shift. The Pharisee, all he could do when he was approaching God is compare himself horizontally and present himself as worthy through his actions. The tax collector, he saw his own weakness, and he was totally honest before God, who already knew all of this anyway. God didn't demand him to cower down before his presence. That's not what God's asking of you. God's asking you to be honest with him because he desires a relationship with you. If God desires a relationship with you, that's the whole picture that we're seeing in all these parables of Jesus is, I am your Father. I am your Father. And your sin is just something that separates us from having a tight relationship. The Pharisee couldn't acknowledge his true self. He put all these barriers in place between him and God. And God was blocked out, not because God didn't want to reach down, but because the Pharisee created the blocks. The tax collector opened up his heart. Now, here's what I've learned in my Christian life is that I'm not the greatest Christian. I'm not the holiest person I know. In fact, I have so many struggles, and those struggles kept me down for so many years because I constantly was trying to compare myself with how other people were doing. I remember the first time this happened, I had a great friend. His name was Peter Kosla. And Peter Kosla seemed to me at the time to be like a great mentor. He was disciplined. He was a businessman. He was philosophically smart. He loved God. He woke up and did devotions, and he led young adults groups, and he was the guy that everybody went to for wisdom. And I remember talking to him one day. I said, I feel like God gave you gifts that he didn't give me. I feel like I'm stuck treading water, and just because God didn't give me the same gifts he's given you, I feel like I can never make moral progress towards God. And I was so frustrated by that. I wonder if some of you are frustrated with the situations that God's given you, the situation that you find yourself in. You're frustrated. You look around and you're like, I don't have the gift that such and such a person have. Or I do have it, but because of my circumstances, God, I wasn't able to fulfill it. Because of these circumstances that I'm in, I'm not able to live the life that I know that you want from me. Here's what I want to say to myself all those years ago. I want to say this. God is most glorified when the human person is fully alive. Okay? So God isn't trying, how do I explain this? God isn't trying to turn me into Peter, the guy that I was mentoring. God isn't trying to turn you into the person that you're looking up to or the person you're comparing yourself into. God is uniquely trying to reflect his glory in you. He's uniquely trying to reflect his glory in you, and your circumstances that he's given you, the ones that you might be complaining about, they're part of it. He's given you those circumstances so that you can be you in those circumstances, relying on God's power and his presence to transform those circumstances to glorify God. See, I kind of found this fascinating this week. I think that part of my life, we are all human, right? We're all human. So we share the same human condition, right? We're all sinners, right? There's so much similarities that we share that I found myself one of millions, billions. How many human beings has God created? I think that's the wrong way to look at it, though. God is infinitely creative. Okay? He's infinitely creative, which means his glory can be reflected in innumerable ways. And he's decided to reflect his glory through you. And you are unique. In all of the history of humanity, there has never been anybody like you. There's never been anybody that's been married to the spouse that you have or don't have, that has the children that you have or don't have, the job that you have or don't have. There's nobody that is uniquely walked the road that you're walking. And God is saying to you today, I want to take you as you are, and I want you to rely on me and offer up to me your brokenness and allow me to meet you there by my Spirit to put wind in the sails of your life. And when you do that, you'll start reflecting my glory like nobody else in the history of the world ever has. God is infinitely creative. His creativity has no bounds, which means that you have no idea what God is doing. As I showed you all those illusions earlier to show how our perspective can be skewed, I think our perspective is so often skewed. We do not see things the way the divine God sees. Let me give you a little example of a story. There's this guy named James Holman. He was a sailor in the 1800s. He was sailing for the Royal Navy at 12, and by the time he hit 25, he had contracted an illness that made him irreversibly blind. The Royal Navy gave him a pension, I suppose, if you will. He had a place to stay for the rest of his life, and he had a job. He had to go to chapel twice a day to give prayers to the king. And the rest of his life was taken care of. But it was a way to put James Holman on a shelf and say, hey, thank you for your service, but you're blind now. This is the best that you can do. James Holman, however, was not content. He got himself a cane with a metal end on it. And he trained himself to be able to use that metal end to echolocate. They say he could sense the difference between a wooden building in front of him and a rock building in front of him. He could sense the difference if it was a horse and buggy or just a small cart coming towards him. They say he could even go into a restaurant and somehow find the very friends in the back of that restaurant that he was looking for. He developed an amazing ability because the rest of his senses were elevated. And he began to do incredible things. He traveled the globe. He traveled the globe as a blind man alone. 250,000 miles James Holman traveled. And he wrote extensively about his travels. And Charles Darwin, the scientist, relied on his travel documents for his scientific work. How? How could it be the case? This man that was supposed to be put on the shelf because he had been deemed unfit for the Royal Navy, traveled 250,000 miles and could see things because his other senses were awakened in a way that other people couldn't. I think that's just a small example of the way that we, as Christians, feel about ourselves. We say, I got this deficiency. I have this sin problem. I have these behaviors that I just can't kick. I got this circumstance I can't seem to thrive out of. And we see ourselves as a Christian that's kind of shelved. God's shelved us. Maybe God hasn't shelved you. Maybe you've shelved yourself. Maybe you've shelved yourself. And maybe God is calling you today to say, no, take your presuppositions, your assumptions about what I'm doing, and get rid of them. You need to ask me what I intend to do through you. You need to invite me in. And so as I started breathing this into my life, slowly, as I was becoming a pastor, I felt like disqualified to be a pastor. I never felt holy enough. I never felt worthy enough. I was in school at Tyndale, and I thought that people kept asking, are you going to be a pastor? I said, no, I'm just trying to I'm just figuring out life. I want to do something that's serves Jesus, but I don't know what it is. I would never put the mantle pastor on myself because I never could arrive. Never could arrive. And I took this course on calling. I remember feeling so discouraged during the course on calling. They said, if you are not so clearly called that you know beyond all sense of knowing that you are to be a pastor, you should do something else. Because if you could imagine yourself doing anything else, you shouldn't be a pastor, and you'll be done within the first 2 years, because that's how hard pastoring is. And I thought, oh boy, what am I going to do now? That's not me. I didn't have that strong sense of calling. I felt unworthy. And finally took this job as a youth pastor in Perry Sound through circumstances that I can't get into right now, but God started to show up and say, through Crystal and I both accepting this job as a youth pastor, which I said I would never do a youth pastor position, and yet God sort of changed my heart. So here I am, I'm a youth pastor in Perry Sound, and I feel like, well, that's not really a pastor. I can do youth. I can do youth, that's okay. And so here I am working, and as I'm working with the youth, I start to see God using my own brokenness to provide healing to some of the youth. And I was like, huh. And the more I was transparent with the youth about the ways in which that I struggled and I was broken, the more victory I saw them get. And that's when God whispered to me this story, the Pharisee and the tax collector. He said, Dennis, I don't need another Pharisee at the pulpit. I need a tax collector who's willing to beat their breast and say, Lord, have mercy on me. I'm a sinner. You need to be a pastor who's willing to show other people how to find mercy with our Lord and Savior, to show other people that it's not about perfection or performance or achievement. It's about coming to his feet, bowing down and saying, Lord, I need you, and then trusting him to show up. It's changed my life. And I know that's what God's called me to do. I know it's what he's called me to do. And it's not a calling I particularly like. I would have rather been a Billy Graham who went around and had stadiums full, and, that would have been more appealing. But God said, no, Dennis, you're meant to be an example of how to humbly seek the throne of mercy. And here's the thing I can tell you, is that God is so merciful, so quick to reach out his hand and pull you up from whatever pit you're in. He never grows weary or tired. He's continually faithful, time and time again. Though we may fall, he'll be there to pick you up. And I've seen people get caught up in the shame. They're like, I can't go back to God like this again. I'm calling on God for his mercy again in the same domain of my life. And they get caught in shame. I'm here to tell you, if you are caught in shame today, if there's something that's defining you, keeping you away from being honest, fully honest with God, today is the day to reach out your hand and say, Jesus, I need you. I need your mercy. I need your grace. And rather than defining yourself as further away from God, all of a sudden, he's right there. He's got you exactly where he wants you, in relationship with him.